Welcome to Lesson 23 in the C# from Start to Finish course. My name is Tim Corey, and today we're going to finish up the tournament viewer form. Once this is done, we'll have every form complete. That doesn't mean we'll be done, but we sure will be close. So let's get started. Just as a review, here's our tournament viewer form. We've wired up this label right here, the rounds drop down, the matchup list box, the displays for Team 1 and Team 2, and even the values for their scores. Today, we're going to wire up this checkbox for unplayed only, and we're going to wire up the score button. Once we wire up the score button, we'll also save this information to either the database or to the text file. So let's start by modifying this checkbox. So I'll open up my Properties window. We're going to go to the Events tab and say whenever this checked is changed. I'll double click this. And what I want to do here is I want to refill this list, but only with the unplayed ones if it's checked, or all of them if it's unchecked. Now we already have something to fill that list. We have load matchups. So you already have that. So let's just call this yet again. We'll actually use this load map. Is not equal to null. That would give us only the ones where they've not been completed yet. But that doesn't really work with our checkbox yet. That just says, here's what you do to only fill in the ones that have not yet been played. So how do we modify this in order to get it so the checkbox determines if we show all the ones that have been played or not? Well, the way to do that would be to add an OR statement here. And this is where your logic will come in for ands and ors. We will say not unchecked let's see, it's not unchecked. Let's go look down here and see what it says. Unplayed only. So not unplayed only checkbox dot checked. So what this is saying if there is a winner, if that's not equal to null, whoops, that should be equal as null. Not equals. So if there is no winner, meaning the winner is null, then add them. Or if the unplayed only is unchecked, see the not first. So let's walk through the process. This is the best way to understand a little more complex of an if statement with an or in the middle. If we come through and the matchup has been played, that means there's a winner marked. So is the winner null? No. So that's a false. But we have an or here. So either one can be true. So is this true? Unplayed only is checked. If the unplayed only is checked, then this is false. Because true, not true is false. So this is false, and this is false as well. Since they're both false, then we would not add the selected item. If this was unchecked, meaning it was false, not false is true. So therefore, if it's unchecked, we'll always add the items whether they're null or not. So sometimes it helps to draw out on paper and just illustrate it that way. But this should work, and we'll demonstrate this in a little bit, but first we have to actually mark items as having been won. So that should take care of our checkbox. Whenever we check or uncheck, matchup is, then we can say for each matchup entry model, ME in M, whoops, not just M, it would be M dot entries. There we go. So for each matchup model in entries, oh, we can't do a for each, we have to do a for. I forgot about that. And we'll do it just like this, actually. So let's just copy and paste this code. So I'll copy that, and I will paste it down here. Remember, we do a for, not a for each, because we want that I counter. And we'll do the same thing, but in reverse. So, and it's still M, so that's great. So instead of saying put the score into the text field, we're going to put the text value into the score field. So let's do that. We can get rid of this extra bi-week stuff, and we can take off the toString and copy this, or actually cut it, and say equals, and score is a, what kind of value? A double. So we'd say double dot parse and our text value. Now again, if the user decides, I'm going to be funny and put something like fail in the score box, that will blow up. So we'll come back through error handling and address that, but that's something to think about. Whenever a user gives you information, you need to check it first. So, in fact, you know what? I'm just so concerned about the user, I'm actually going to pull this out into its another method, bool parse or score valid equals double dot try parse. There's our string, and we have out, and this is the result. Let's say score val. And we'll say double score val equals 0. There is a better way of doing this in 2017, Visual Studio 2017, with C#7. They allow you to actually declare this in line. So you'd say out int score, or out double score val. So that's a nice new feature of C#7. If you catch my video on YouTube, I'll have one on the things I like and don't like about C# 7.0. as well as one on Visual Studio itself. So I'll have those up soon if I don't already by the time you're watching this. But definitely check those out for the new stuff if you can use it. But for now, we'll still do this. It's not that much more. And then down here, we will wrap this in an if statement. Surround with if score valid. Else, and this is the problem area, we could do m.entries 0.score equals 0, or we could do nothing at all. I kind of like not doing anything at all because then they're not actually modifying anything. So let's just do a message box dot show. Please enter a valid score for team 1. You know it's team 1. And I'm going to do a return. And the reason I'm doing return is because I don't want them to continue. I don't want them to actually move on to the next one and put a score in there, modify a score, because they've already broken something. So let's actually do that. That'll exit out of the entire method. So we don't need to set this information. And then we'll do the same thing down here, where we'll actually grab this same code. In fact, let's copy the entire thing. We don't need the else. I'm going to paste it right above the code. And we have to make all the different changes to this. So score 2 value, team 2 score value, team 2 score value. And we don't need a double parse. Sorry about that. There we go. If the score is valid, we've already parsed it in the score val variable. Makes our code a little bit cleaner. So now we should have everything except for that, which we just changed. And now we can modify or take this out. And we don't need to change the text for the team name, so we'll take that out as well. So now what happens is when you click the score button, it should update the team with the correct values. Now, we're not done yet. Let's go after this for loop. So after you loop through both the first and the second team, and we haven't returned early because they put a bad value in, we should be able to say, and let's actually capture these values outside of our if statement. So I'm going to actually say double team 1 score equals 0, double team 2 score equals 0. And so I'll actually replace this. I'll do the same thing down here. I'll actually replace it. Remember that anything inside of the curly braces lives in that scope. So any of my variables live inside that scope and they die at the end of those same curly braces. Therefore, I don't have access to those variables outside of the scope of this if statement. Therefore, in order to access them, I have to create the variables outside the scope. In this case, I created variables in the scope of the event method. That way I can have access to them throughout the event. And the reason why is this. I'm going to say if team 1 score is greater than team 2 score, that means team 1 wins. So if team 1 wins, we need to take that team entry and put it into our matchup as the winner. So we'd say m.winner equals m.entries 0 dot team competing. So we'll take the team that's competing and mark that as the winner of our matchup. Now this winner is no longer null, which that's what we're checking for when we display or not display the items based upon if we allow completed ones to show up. So we've taken matchup entry 0. Now how do I know that's a valid spot? We don't want a out of bounds error in my array. I know that's valid because I know that I have 2 working scores, team 1 and team 2, because we went through that. Now, if I only have a team 1, guess what? I will still mark team 1 as the winner because they really are. For example, if team 1 is Tim's team and team 2 is actually the bye, we only have one team. Therefore, team 1, the score, if it's greater than 0, is the winner. Now, this does raise the issue of high score versus low score for the winner. And if you want to support the idea of, for example, golf, where the low score wins, then what you'd have to do is reverse this greater than to a less than. If you want to support both, we'll have to have a setting in our application somewhere where we say it's high score wins or low score wins. And then you do either wrap this in another if statement that says if high score wins, do this one, else do the other one, or something like that. And you can store that information in your app.config if you want, or you could store it in your database. But for now, we're going to say that high score wins. So, if team 1 score is greater than team 2 score, team 1 score is the winner. And this is where the else is kind of tricky, because what if they're tied? In this case, if I just do an else and it's a tie will always go to team 2. Now, we probably shouldn't have a tie, but if we did, what would we do? So I'm going to say else if and say team 2 score is greater than team 1 score. Oops. And then I'll do m.winner equals m.entries 1 team competing. And I'm going to leave off, or I'll actually tell them else message box dot show I do not handle tie games. So I'm not going to mark a winner. I won't say who won. I'll just say that they're even as of right now. And that's it. So there's our logic for marking who won and who didn't. And now based upon which one is scored. Let's see if this works first, and then we'll get into how we handle saving this information to the database and some other considerations. So we're going to load our first tourney. And we have the uncanny losers. Let's give them a score of 5. And we have to deal with this because normally we shouldn't even see this because they should be marked as 1 already. So we should already have them either put a 1 in here or something like that and just have it marked as winner. But let's mark them as a winner and see what happens. Nothing seems to have changed, but we come back to it, 5 is in that box again, that's good. If we unchecked the unplayed only, notice we only have 1 team now because Uncanny Losers has completed their round. Now if we mark Sue's team as having 10 and score that, in theory, we have a problem. And the reason we have a problem is because I checked the unplayed only, and we have no entries for unplayed only. And this raises a bug in our code. And it says sequence contains no elements. So I had said load matchup, get the first one. Well, we can't do that because there is no first one in an empty list. So let's solve this problem by saying surround with if selected matchups.count is greater than 0. Now it runs just fine. Now it didn't clear out this list, which we've got to work on that. But for now, at least this works. Now here's what I do. When I spot a bug like this where I still have values over here, first of all I say, is this really a bug or is it just something we can live with and not worry about? And if it's a bug where I say, nope, I really can't live with that, then what I do is I write it down on a piece of paper somewhere, and I find paper is much better for this than trying to put it in electronic format, just because electronic format tends to draw me away from what I'm doing, and I get sucked into other things, especially web-based stuff. Because web-based stuff, you're there, you're putting your stuff in, all of a sudden you realize, hey, I've got a new email, and I click on that. Or, you open up my new tab for my Chrome browser, gives me the day's headlines at the bottom, the popular Bing searches. And it gives me my 6 or 8 popular websites to go to, the ones I go to all the time. Well, that's distracting. So I'll end up going to 3 or 4 of those websites and looking at a couple of news stories, and that takes me down a path. And so that electronic tool, which is supposed to save me time, ends up costing me 10, 15 minutes of distraction. So I'll usually write down on a piece of paper what, there's a bug here where nothing in the matchup list and the last selected team is still available or still viewable. So I'd probably clear that out. But we also have to address the idea of if this list is blank, should we even see any of this stuff? And the answer is probably no. So before we go any further, let's actually deal with this bug. I wouldn't recommend doing this in real life. And I hesitate to even do it here because I don't want to show you things that you really shouldn't do. So, but I do want to address it, but I also don't want to lose a thread of where we're at. And right now, under the score button, which has way too much code right in the event, we should create at least one method for this. I don't want to lose the fact that we're not done yet in this. We have to actually save this information to the database or to the text file. So I do want to address that as well. But this is a pretty simple fix. And so let's actually address this right away. So I'm going to pin actually going to stop it first. I'm going to look at my properties. Again, if you come up here, all right, there we go. It's this icon right here where my mouse is, and it's the property window. Right now we're in the events window, or events section of our property window. So I'm going to go to properties, and I want to see the names of these fields. So text one name, team one name, team one score label, team one score value. So I'm assuming these are the same. So if I remember team 1 and team 2, I can get 6 of these right away. So let's go look at where the matchups are actually shown. Load matchups. What we're going to do here is we're going to say display matchup info. And that's it. I'm going to call this method called display private void display matchup info. And we're going to say if selected matchups dot count is greater than 0, so we do have something to show. If we do, then team1 name dot visible equals true. And actually, we can make this a little bit easier. Let's say bool is visible equals, and check this out. I keep the parens, because I like parens around things when I'm assigning them. Now, what did I just do there? This is called a shortcut, and I'm not always a huge fan of shortcuts, and if it all confuses you, don't do it. What I'm saying here is this right here, it was the heart of my if statement. This is the part that evaluates the true or false. And based upon that true or false, I do something. I'm taking that and capturing the result of it instead of doing some kind of action on it. So I'm saying, here's the evaluation, store that in a Boolean. I could make this back into an if statement, and if this was true, set is visible equal true, and if it's false, set is visible equal to false. But I could just take this value and put it right into is visible. But now I can say team1 name.visible equals is visible. Do you see why it's better? Because now I don't have to specify team1 name.visible twice. Once for true, once for false. Now I just do it based upon this Boolean variable. I'm just setting all the values to the same Boolean. Okay, team2 score label and team2 score value. And now I have to grab those couple others. This one right here is versus label, and it's a score button. So is visible and score button dot visible equals is visible. So now every time we load the matchups, we're going to run this check. And this check says if we have values in our selected matchups, then we set everything to visible. That's to be true. If we don't have values in our matchups, set everything to invisible or false. Let's see this in action. So load tourney. I will mark this as scored. Let's do our check versus uncheck. Notice it did not refresh this to take it out of the list. But now notice my score information is gone. Now it's back. Now it's gone. And that's based upon whether or not we have values in our list box. So that's good. But now we have to also take it out of the list if this is checked and we've scored it. And that's actually not too hard to do. So let's go ahead and do that right away. So the way to do this is to come down and look at our event for the unplayed only checkbox underscore check changed. All we do is call the load matchups again. So let's select that and let's actually run that in the score button at the very end. Now what this is going to do, I'm going to run this. What it's going to do is every time we change a value and hit score, it'll refresh this list. And there we go. Now it responds more like we expected it to. And if we score this, it even takes it all the way away. So that's great. That's exactly what we wanted. Now let's put a tie in here. And we don't handle tie games. So everything is working like it should. The only thing we have not yet done is whenever this button is clicked, we want to store this in the database or text file. And that's actually not that hard to do. So let's look back at our score button click. And we're going to need to clean this up and take it out of the button underscore click event and do it more like this. So we're going to need to do that in a minute. But for now, what I want to do is actually complete the action. And then we'll look at how to actually extract it out. And I may save that for our video on refactoring. Because refactoring is an important part of an application. But if you see something when you first create it, definitely do it then. But there's a lot of times when you come to an application where you're like, oh, that could be done so much better. And so it is a good idea to also learn how to refactor. So that may be one that it's not contrived necessarily. I don't want to do anything contrived. But it is something where I could refactor it now, or I could come back to it and refactor. And for the sake of demonstration, I think I'll come back to it and refactor. All right, so before we go any further, let's figure out how to save the information. Now, if we come over here to our Solution Explorer, we have the iData connection, where we create items, create tournament, create team, create person, create prize, and we get items. Let's create a new type. I'm going to put a little bit of spacing here. We're going to say void update matchup. Matchup model. Now, why no return type? Well, because if we work on an object, then anything we do gets passed back to the caller because, again, it's just that address. But also, we're just updating. We're just saying, take the information that I already have, input it in the database so I can get it back next time I call the database. So let's go to SQL. I believe we're actually in SQL right now, but I can check. Yep, we're in SQL right now, so let's start with SQL. And it yells at us about not having implemented the contract fully. So we can do our control dot or do the drop down and say implement interface. And then find that entry. Got a lot of code in here now. So what are we going to do to update our matchup? Well, there's actually a couple things we need to do. One is we need to store the matchup, and two is we need to store the matchup entries. Now let's go to our SQL first. We'll start there. And let's look at We don't want to create two different store procedures if we don't have to. So let's also work on changing that. And this is a question you have to address. There is another way of doing this, which would be to create two store procedures. One to update the score, one to update the team competing ID. And then they're specialized for exactly what you want them. Or you can create one that does both. I think we're just going to create the one for this. I don't really think we need to have two separate ones to do almost the same thing. It's just a little bit less to maintain in our SQL list here. So let's create a new store procedure. We'll start with matchups. I'll actually span out the columns for this and for matchup entries. So let's get rid of the top stuff. And we're going to say dbo dot sp matchups underscore update. We're going to pass in at ID int. Now it's not an output, it's an input this time. So the at ID and the at winner ID. And that's all we're going to update. We're not going to allow them to move matchups to a different round. We're not going to allow them to move a matchup to a different tournament. So therefore, we only need these two values. So now we can say update dbo.matchups set winner ID equals at winner ID, where ID equals at ID. It's very important, and I've covered this in my SQL course, but it's very important that you have this where clause. If you don't, if you forget and just have this, guess what happens? Every record has the winner ID set to whatever you passed in. Every record. That's a real bummer when you have production data. It's still a bummer when you have test data because you just wiped out all that information. It's really a bummer if you don't have a good backup. So be careful of that. Inserts, you can't do a ton of damage with an insert. Updates, you can do an awful lot of damage. So just be careful to have all of that, and don't accidentally select just this and hit execute. Because again, if something is highlighted, only that code gets run. So let's create this procedure. And now we have our procedure. It takes just ID and winner ID. Let's go to our code. And I will write this in a comment. And now we can copy the code for a less complex example of a write. Here's a pretty simple one. I'll just copy this and use this as a pattern to get started. So it'd be at ID and at winner ID. No output. The first one is the matchup or model.id, that's right. And the second one is the model.winner.id. So we need to also create that connection. The one I copied from had the connection passed in. So I have to create that. Notice how Visual Studio cleaned up my code for me and formatted it nicely. That was very nice of them. Makes our lives a little bit easier. So let's pass in the correct stored procedure name. And that should be it. So now we've updated our matchup. But we're not done there. Back over in SQL, we have to create another stored procedure. And this time it's for matchup entries. And so we're going to pass in the ID. And then we're going to pass in the team competing ID, int, and we'll say equals 0. That allows us to say, well, if we don't know the team competing, we don't have to pass that value in. If we don't pass it in, the default and just the team competing ID. And that takes care of updating this record. And actually, now that I look at it, we also allowed nulls. So let's actually put it to null instead of 0. Remember I said that a score of 0 is actually a valid score? So let's do that. So now we can say update dbo.matchup entries set team competing ID equals at team competing ID, comma, score equals at score, where ID equals at ID. So now I'm updating two values, the team competing ID and the score. If we don't pass in one of the values, it will be set to null. All right, so let's grab this. So we have ID, team competing ID, and score. All right, so there's our store procedure. There's our 3 parameters. And that's just my notes so I don't forget what to put in each section. Now we will do a copy of this and do a for each. For each, and I start with the collection first. Usually, it just makes it a little easier to team competing is me dot team competing dot ID. And the winner is, it's not a winner, it's a score. I hate when it does that. Score, there we go. The reason it did that is because I double clicked on here, I was going to hit Control V. The problem was that I was getting too fast and I hit Control click. And that brought up this peak as a definition for string, which, okay, it's kind of cool. If I'm a Control click here, it will bring up the definition of model or matchup entry model, and I can look through it. That's kind of neat. But I often get in too much of a hurry, trying to go too fast, and double click and paste at the same time, and that makes me do that. So that's why it happens. It's a nice feature to have, but it also can get in my way once in a while. Okay, so we need to change the value for score to be me.score. Now, we're passing in all three values here, but this one right here could be a problem. Because if we don't have a team competing yet, then we would have an error. Now we should have a team competing by now, because if we're saving a matchup and updating it, we're either updating it to add the team or we're updating it to say what the new score is. But if we have a new score, that means it already has a team. So in theory, this should never crash. And if it does crash, that means that we're trying to set the score for an entry that doesn't have a team. So now we have updated the matchup, and we've updated, well, that's the wrong store procedure. That's why you check these things. That's why I hate the copy paste, because copy paste method, when I copy this whole thing here, I forgot to go all the way to the bottom and change everything. That's why I sometimes do the comment method, where I comment out every line and then just uncomment as I modify a line. That way, if I had done that, I would have seen, oops, haven't done this line yet. So I'm not a big fan of copy paste, and yet I use it a lot just because it is a huge time saver. But you have to be meticulous about making sure that you've changed everything. Use a system to help you. With that being said, I think that this is now done. We've now updated our matchup. Let's save that. We'll save the iData connector. We'll come back over to the code behind for our tournament viewer form. And we'll say global configuration. Actually, config. Control dot. Add the using statement, dot, connection, dot, we need to look for the update matchup, and pass in our matchup. We can look up above, our matchup is M, but let's verify that. M is the matchup we're working on. Therefore, we pass in M. Now we have not yet implemented the text connector. Let's do that real quick, but not actually do anything with it. Just so we can run the SQL side of things and make sure that we have an updated value going through. Load tournament. Let's do uncanny losers first. Let's give them a 1 and say score. Note that if I do this, they're now off the list. Let's close this out. And actually have to close the entire application, because even if I were to reopen at this point, that model has been updated by our code. Therefore, it still has the newer values. The way to verify it's in the database is close all the way out, reopen, and then check to make sure those values are still there. Let's do that, and notice uncanny losers is marked 1-0 versus the bye week, and they have been marked as played. Now we don't yet have a matchup, which we're going to need to take care of that too, because this should say uncanny losers. We know at least half the team's coming through, so we'll take care of that in a minute. But we at least know we're saving to SQL. Now we could also verify by going to SQL and coming to our matchups. Let's go back to this right here, and we'll say run again. Now we have a winner of 2 for this entry. We have a score of 1 over here. So we've got data going in. That's great. But now we have to deal with the text connector side of things. We can't forget about that. Now again, here we have most of the code already. So let's go through and add the rest. So what are we going to put in here to actually save our matchup? Well, let's come over to our text connector processor first. That's where all of our code is that works on things like the matchup model. So I want to do a model dot update. So let's scroll down here. We have, this is a matchup model where you say save matchup to file. It's more important to get your application running than it is to write really amazing code. Now, don't get me wrong, amazing code is amazing, but it should not be at the expense of taking an extra day, 2 days, 3 days to get your application running. The other danger of writing amazing code is it's usually more complex, which means more debugging time. So I would rather see an application written with simple code that got the job done and got out the door. And then you said, okay, now it's time to refactor. And you saw if you could make that a little more powerful by crunching it down to one method, making different methods off of it, whatever you need to do. So that's my encouragement to you. I said it before, I'll probably say it again, but better to ship than it is to have awesome code that never sees the light of day. All right, so I made a copy of all this code. I'm going to create a new public static void update matchup. What's this called? Save matchup to file, update matchup to file. That's a little bit of a weird name, but it matches the other pattern and you understand what it's doing. This matchup model, and we'll call it model. And up here we called it matchup. So let's actually keep those two comparable. That way when I paste my code in here, everything should still work the same. But we don't want to work entirely the same because, for example, this code right here is finding the ID to add to our matchup. We don't need that. But we also have this code right here which adds our matchup to the list, which is great except for one thing. And that is we already have a matchup in this list that matches our matchup. It just doesn't have the new information. We're doing an update here. So before we add our matchup to the matchups list, we have to take the other matchup out. So for each matchup model, M in matchups, if m.id equals matchup.id. So if the two have the same ID, then matchups.remove m. Now we're going to try that, but sometimes, and for good reason, sometimes when you change the list that you're looping on, it causes a problem. If that's the case, what we'll do, in fact, you know what? We're going to avoid the potential of being a problem. We're going to say matchup model, and this would be the old matchup. And then we'll say, instead of removing it, we'll say old matchup equals m. Why is that different? Well, we're just taking the matchup we find and putting that address into this instance. Then when we're done, we can say matchups.remove old matchup. Now it's going to yell at us and say it's unassigned. And the reason it says it's unassigned is because the only way it's assigned is if this is true at some point. It does not have to be true. Therefore, we have to say establish a new instance. Update them. Therefore, we will say update entry to file. We'll come down here to the save entry to file. We'll actually copy this entire thing so we even have the signature of the method name. And we're going to paste it down below. We'll call this update. And we don't need the file name passed in. We fixed that. So we can call it from the global context or global config. So now this is the same thing. So we'll follow the same pattern. We'll get rid of the ID check. We'll say matchup entry model. And we'll call this old entry equals new matchup entry model. For each matchup entry model, E in entries, if e.id equals old, not old entry, entry.id. If the two are the same, then old entry equals e. Then down below, we say entries.remove old entry. And now the original value for our matchup entry model is gone. And the rest of this is fine. It loops through, it updates the information, and it writes that to the config file or to the file. So therefore, we don't need to pass in the file name. We should be good now to call this update matchup to file. So we should be able to say model.update matchup to file. And that should be all there is to updating our information in a text file. Let's run this and find out. Whoops, we're still in SQL. So let's change this to be a text file. Run it again. We have the it might work tourney. Sounds good. We have two values. The worst team has a bye week. That's convenient. Let's score them. Let's first check this. Then we'll score them. And now they go off the list. Now it should be that was called, which means if I close all this out and start over again, the It Might Work tournament, the work and actually let's call before the load matchups, just in case they also have changed the dropdown, which I don't think they could, but just to be on the safe side. So what we'll do is we'll update the parent ID of the value. So it's a little hard to explain, but let's look at what our models say. This model says parent matchup ID. So it says this team, whoever they are, came from this parent matchup ID. Well, now we know what the parent matchup ID is. We can go find that because the current matchup, since it's scored, this becomes the parent. We go find where that parent matchup ID matches our current ID and say, okay, well, here's your team for that tournament or for that matchup. Let's see how this works. So what we're going to do is do a for each. We're going to loop through all of our matchups. Now, what are our matchups? We have a list at the very top of our tournament. Inside our tournament model has all the matchups. Remember those round of rounds? So therefore, we can go through each of those rounds. So list of matchup model, round in tournament.rounds. Then for each matchup model, M, nope, we can't do M because that's already being used up here. So let's call this RM for round matchup in round. So now we have each matchup. Now we say for each, it's one more for each, right? This is a matchup entry model. We'll call this me in rm.entries. Because don't forget that the matchup entry is what holds the parent matchup. Because each entry has a different parent. So now we can say if me.parent matchup .id. Now we did have, I don't know if you noticed, we did have parent matchup ID. Now that's what comes from the database. Remember that the database doesn't load the object, it just loads the ID. We could rely on that ID still, except for one fact. If this hasn't pulled from a database, if it's pulled just from our object, which was just created, our tournament model object, if it pulled from that, then the parent matchup ID would be blank or 0. We can always trust, though, the parent matchup.id, because whenever we rehydrate the model, we always fill in the actual object. Therefore, we can trust this. It's the trustworthy one. So if that parent matchup.id equals our m.id, which is our current matchup ID, if those two are the same, then we have a match. And we can say a round matchup, because this is the one we actually modify, the round matchup. So make sure you get that right. Don't put M, even though it would work, it wouldn't actually update the correct matchup, therefore you wouldn't see the parent being updated properly. So, with that being said, we don't need to modify SQL or the text connector because it's already in place. We already know everything we need to know. Now we can say start, go to it might work, load the tournament. Now we've already scored this and we didn't mark it as mark the parent of the next round. So let's score it again. And we have an error. Let's pull that error message back up for a minute. I went way too quickly. It says object reference not set to an instance of an object. Remember me telling you that you'd see this message more and more once you started using class instances? Yep, you see it a lot. So I'm trying to access the parent matchup when a record doesn't have a parent matchup. Remember that every matchup doesn't have a parent. Round 1, there is no parent matchup that it came from. Therefore, I have to bypass this. So let's move it up one line. Isn't that excellent? So there's nothing in round 1. Round 2 only has 1 game because we only have the 1 game to play. Now we're not going to deal yet with what happens when we win the last game, because that's once we get things set up a little more, then we'll come back and actually do the report and the celebration and all the rest of a person who wins. So let's save that for later, but for now we know that everything is working for capturing this information. Just to verify, and it's always good to verify, let's come to program.cs, change this to SQL, just to make sure it doesn't work any differently with SQL. We'll grab our first tourney, we'll score the uncanny losers, and it says, oh, you can't do that. Object reference not set to an instance of an object. Let's find out why. The winner ID is null. Remember I said that we should always have a winner ID because we're scoring this. Actually, that was actually team competing ID. But we didn't check for winner ID. So why are we storing a record that doesn't have a winner ID? Matchup not yet determined. You see why we're not storing it? Because we don't have a winner yet for this matchup. But we do know now that one of the teams competing is the uncanny losers. Therefore, we don't store this information. We don't actually store it at all. So what we'll do is we'll actually move the cursor up here, wrap all of this in surround with an if statement, and say if model.winner is not equal to null. Why? Well, if we're just updating the entries, we don't need to update the matchup as well. Therefore, we can skip over this section. We don't have to do it at all. Let's hit continue. And now it says, hey, wait a minute, object reference not set to an instance of an object. This is the one where I said, yeah, we'll always have it. I was wrong. So let's find out why. Well, if we're looking at this, the first one is uncanny losers in our model. I can zoom in here for you so you don't strain your eyes. But if we go to the second model entry, team competing is null. Well, that's kind of a bummer. So what do we do here? Well, we again surround with our if statement. But here, we actually need to move it all up here, and we'll surround this entire thing because we don't want to do the update if the team competing is null. Because if the team competing is null, it shouldn't have a score either. So therefore, surround with if statement. This is the way you test your code because it worked in text file, and we didn't actually modify anything in the text file save to do this, do the update. Therefore, we thought, oh, it's going to work everywhere. Not so fast. So we still have some bugs in our logic, and that's okay. So if me.teamCompeting is not equal to null, because if the team competing is null, we don't have a team competing ID, and we don't have a score. Hit continue on that. And now if we go to round 2, we'll see that uncanny sort of system that emails out probably, or at least displays a message that says, hey, Sue won and beat everyone in the contest. And so for tournament XYZ, Sue is the winner. That will also be the place where we'll say, okay, Sue is in first place, therefore Sue gets X number of dollars. Or, however that works out for the prizes. So if Sue has first place and first place is marked as 50%, we'll calculate how much the entire tournament brought in and then say Sue gets half of that. So we'll do all that. So it's still quite a few steps to do, but really we're on the very tail end of this application. We're almost done. And now we're in the cleanup wrap-up phase. So definitely stick around. We got more stuff to do, but also be encouraged that we're very, very close to being done.